Hello, everyone. This is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, and today I am here with John O'Grady, who is a spokesperson for the Save the U.S. EPA. Hello, John.
Hello, how are you?
Great. Thanks so much for coming on.
And thank you for having us.
Yes. So, could you tell us a little bit about what Save the U.S. EPA is?
Well, it's an effort by the union that represents over 8,000 U.S. EPA employees nationwide to draw attention to the fact, number one, that the U.S. EPA budget is a mere 0.2% of the overall federal budget, and yet this administration and this Congress are attempting to cut EPA to the point in terms of its budget and staffing levels that it will be totally ineffective.
And when did this group start?
We started up this program about a year and a half ago now, and we're doing our very best to get the word out and provide facts and figures to the American public so they can make their own mind up.
And you said it's an effort by the union. So what is your position?
I am the president of AFGE Council 238, which represents, as I mentioned, over 8,000 employees working at the U.S. EPA nationwide. We have 14 locals, one in each regional office, for example, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and so on. And then we have regional laboratories that perform specialized work, for example, our National Vehicle and Fuel Emissions Laboratory in Ann Arbor, which everyone would be familiar with from the standpoint of the EPA rated mileage on new cars.
So what all does the EPA do? I know we hear about it in things like car emissions, but what are the areas that the EPA is in charge of overseeing?
Well, the U.S. EPA was actually started in 1970, December 2nd, 1970, because there was very, very serious problems with the air quality, with water quality, and with contamination on the land. Many people don't remember, but there's a river in Ohio called the Cuyahoga, which actually caught on fire over 13 times before people thought to themselves, gee, this is not normal. This is not ordinary. Rivers shouldn't catch on fire. And we had things like Love Canal come to surface in the late 70s, early 80s. We had valleys in Tennessee and Kentucky that were literally filled with drums of chemicals at various levels. And it was just very, very sloppy. There was such air pollution that in Pittsburgh, for example, in the late 60s, people would have their headlights on at noontime because it was so dark.
So what are the things that the EPA helped put into place to change that?
Right. So once the public outcry was sufficient, then EPA was formed and established, and Congress passed some laws, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and a number of other individual statutes. Currently, we oversee over 30 statutes, and we develop regulations to implement those statutes. And those are open to public debate and comments and criticisms and all that sort of thing. So it's a very open, transparent process. So what we do basically is we do not prevent pollution, which I wish we could, but we don't. What we do is we regulate the amount of pollution that can go into the air or into a watershed and still have air that we can breathe without being subject to carcinogenic chemicals or to excessive amounts of particulate matter. We regulate the amount of toxic pollutants that can go into waterways and still have a fishable, swimmable, navigable body of water. So we basically clean stuff up.
You said that the EPA started in 1970. So that was while Nixon was president.
Yes, that is correct.
Nixon, of course, was a Republican. Has the EPA generally been something that has been supported by both parties?
Yes, actually, it's really strange that this has ever become a partisan issue. Up until President Ronald Reagan, environment was considered something along the lines of Social Security. It was something you just didn't touch or interfere with. You supported it, both Republicans and Democrats. However, in somewhere in the 80s, people got this crazy idea that the EPA was bad for the economy. That's totally false, and I can give you a clear example why it's totally false.
Mhm.
If the EPA was a job-killing agency, if the EPA was bad for the economy, then the economy should have failed in 1972 or 1973 or 1974 and so on. It didn't. Rather, what happened was we cleaned up our environment. Industry actually found ways to save money by not polluting, and we created an entire market niche of environmental consulting, environmental products that became known worldwide. And up until this administration, we're considered the premier environmental protection agency in the world.
One of the concerns right now is the slashing of the budget for the EPA. You talked about things like staffing levels. What is this budget actually proposing in terms of the EPA?
Okay, let me put it in perspective first of all. In 1999, the U.S. EPA had 18,110 people working for the agency nationwide. And our budget was probably in the neighborhood of $7 billion. Today, we're down to 14,140 people, and our budget is just under $8 billion. Now, what this administration proposed to do for 2018 was to slash our budget down to $5.6 billion and cut 25% of the workforce, so to bring us down to under probably 11,000 employees. Again, in the 2019 proposal, the administration again proposes basically the same thing. And I believe they're going to be successful one way or another unless people start talking to their congressional reps and their U.S. senators. And here's why. In the 2018 budget that has actually been passed by the House and separate bill passed by the Senate, there's identical language in those bills setting aside $79 million for buyouts, meaning that they would offer current employees at the U.S. EPA up to $25,000 to retire early. Well, that could mean that amount, $79 million, could amount to over 2,000 employees leaving the agency, which, if that happened, would bring us down to 12,000 employees. Again, it would cripple us. Right now, we're crippled. We don't have enough people to do the job, and we don't have enough money to get the job done.
What does that look like on the ground? You said that wouldn't be enough people to get the job done. What kinds of jobs, what kinds of things are people going out doing that wouldn't be done?
Real simple. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and all of the acts, laws, and regulations that we implement basically rely on the honor system. In other words, companies know the regulations are out there. They get permits issued generally by the states, not U.S. EPA, because, and here's a fact most people don't know, 96% of U.S. EPA's programs have been authorized at the state level. So the company is supposed to comply with that permit, but the only way you can really ensure that they comply with that permit is to occasionally go out and take samples. And if you cut the number of inspectors in the field, if you cut even the travel dollars for inspectors to go into the field, no samples are taken. No samples means no data. No data means no enforcement. No enforcement, you have no EPA. It's kind of like you're driving down the highway. When I'm driving down the highway, for example, and of course I never exceed the speed limit, but when I see a state police officer parked on the side, I slow down. That's what U.S. EPA does. It slows down people cheating against their permits. It makes sure that they make a better effort or their best effort to comply.
Are there particular regions or particular types of things that are most likely to be hard hit by this?
Well, this administration has taken a very hard hit against geographical initiatives. For example, the Great Lakes program to clean up the Great Lakes and to bring it, to continue to restore it, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. That was budgeted at $300 million for a number of years. They're proposing last year to zero it out. This year they're proposing to cut it to $30 million. So cut it from $300 to $30 million. There's other initiatives going on like the Chesapeake Bay Initiative or the Puget Sound Initiative. And these are all bodies of water that have been contaminated by industry that are being cleaned up, and the money that EPA the U.S. EPA gives to the states to work on these efforts actually gets multiplied because they hire consultants, they hire local workers to do the work, and it's a very effective program. But this administration is trying to cut those programs to the bone.
What does this mean for things like what we saw in Flint, Michigan? Are we more likely to see that sort of thing, drinking water contamination, if the EPA is cut and you're not able to regulate those sorts of things?
Yes, and let me explain first that most people don't realize that not only is the U.S. EPA budget a very tiny, tiny portion of the overall federal budget, but the little bit of money that we have, 65% of it goes directly through the agency to the states, municipalities, and tribal authorities. So we only have 35% of our budget to work with for staffing and so forth, equipment, all that kind of stuff. But here's what happens. This administration is not only cutting our budget, but they're cutting the money that passes through to the states. Now, Flint, Michigan, it was a horrible thing. 9,000 children between the ages of, I believe, 1 and 6 were exposed to extremely toxic levels of lead in their drinking water. And it's drinking water like you and I would have at our tap. It looks clean, smells clean, it tastes clean, but it wasn't clean. It was contaminated by parts per billion of lead. And to put that in perspective, imagine a football stadium filled with 1 billion white ping pong balls. You take 10 ping pong balls out, you paint them red, and then you disperse them into that 1 billion mix. That would be 10 parts per billion. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Levels so low, you can't even see them. You can't smell them, you can't taste them, but they can hurt you very much. And with respect to Flint, to put this in perspective, to take the 30,000-foot level view, there are a little over 15,000 public drinking water systems throughout the United States. There are 5,300 of those systems that are at or near failure. So they could be the next Flint, Michigans. And this administration is doing nothing. The reason why it's a concern, virtually every older city, Chicago, New York, Detroit, you name it, has lead service lines because that's what they thought was the state of the art about 100 years ago. Put in lead service lines. Well, that is a source of lead contamination. In addition, we still see evidence of certain municipalities digging up old water lines, and the state-of-the-art technology prior to lead service lines were hollowed out logs, believe it or not. And you can still Google the internet and you can see some of these things. So we have a lot of investment to do in our infrastructure to ensure that once the water is purified, it gets to the household in the same condition. And we can't guarantee that right now.
So you just mentioned infrastructure. That's been sort of a buzzword lately that, we should have an infrastructure spending bill. Some people seem to be putting up working on environmental regulations as opposed to working on infrastructure. Are you suggesting that that's sort of one and the same, that we can combine those into one path moving forward?
Well, there should be no conflict, and in my mind, there never was a conflict between having a clean environment and having a healthy economy. We've proven that since 1970, since the EPA came on board. Now, there are some people that would say, in order to get this done, we have to waive environmental regulations. Or they might say, we have to waive OSHA regulations, worker safety regulations. Or we have to waive the minimum wage so we can pay these people peanuts. And all of this is really false talk. It's talk that puts more money into the hands of the corporate profiteers. I'm not against corporations, but I am against greed. There's no reason why you can't fix infrastructure, pay people a living wage, and protect our environment. There's no reason.
So if people would like to know more